Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wildlife Wednesday. My name is Tyler Greenlee, and I'm super excited to bring you another monthly live broadcast. This month, we're going to feature some large carnivores, some northern lights, and some baby animals. And so, without further ado, we'll get started with our first video all about carnivores this spring. Welcome to the June 2024 Carnivore Update. This month, we will be featuring grizzly bears, wolves, and then a special surprise animal at the end of the video. To start off, we're going to be talking about grizzly bears, and the month of May has some of the best grizzly bear sightings on offer in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. One bear that has been incredibly prominent on tour recently has been grizzly bear 610. Grizzly bear 610 for the past couple years has been rearing 3 cubs, and this spring she emerged with all of those cubs very much large and alive. This is a great feat for a mother bear, as 50% of grizzly bear cubs don't make it until their second year. And so it's really great that grizzly bear 610 has been able to raise these 3 cubs to subadulthood. But now it is time for these cubs to head out on their own. And you can see how large they are compared to her mother. They are definitely becoming mature grizzly bears and are very bold and confident when they're with their mother. Typically, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, grizzly bears stay with their mothers until their 3rd spring. At this time, the mother bear begins to come back into estrus and is preparing to have another litter of cubs in the following spring. And so she's going to be looking for males to mate with. The subadults cannot be around during that time because male grizzlies will not hesitate to kill subadult bears. And so female grizzlies become very aggressive and will actually chase their youngsters away during this time. Here is a video of one of 610 subadults during that time when she is chasing that cub away. And so we were watching these grizzly bears at about 200 yards, and all of a sudden 610 began to chase that cub, and then we all had to run for the vehicle. Grizzly bear 610's mother, grizzly bear 399, the queen of the Tetons, has also been very visible on tour this spring, and she is always present with her absolutely gargantuan cub, who is actually a year younger than 610 subadults and is absolutely massive. It's believed that 399's cub is so large because as a single cub, it's getting all of the food resources that would normally be split between siblings. Grizzly bear 399, of course, is really well known for having 4 cubs in her most previous litter, and all of those cubs had to split food resources among each other. And so this larger cub, all on its own, is probably getting all of the food from the pantry. Now, these videos of grizzly bear 399 and her gigantic cub were taken pretty early in the spring. You can see it's very brown at this time of year. There's not a lot of green vegetation, and there's not really any elk calves or protein sources for them to feed on, except for rodents underground. And they are also feeding a lot on tubers, such as spring beauty, yellow bells, and hopefully now they're taking advantage of that biscuit root. But this early springtime can be a really difficult time of year for these bears. Here's her cub, who clearly had an itch on his front leg. During this time of sparse resources, it's really great to see these bear claws, the claws that these grizzlies have, which are incredibly long, come into use when they're searching for food. Grizzlies historically were known to live in areas where other bears couldn't survive, such as the Great Plains of North America. Related brown bears still live in the Gobi Desert and on the steppes of Mongolia, and these claws are what helps keep these bears alive when they are out in that open country. Using their long claws, brown bears can take advantage of roots and mammals that other bears can otherwise not reach, and this has allowed them to spread across the globe onto many different continents. Out on tour, we don't just see female grizzlies, we also encounter males occasionally. And so here is an incredibly large male grizzly that we saw recently in Grand Teton National Park, and he is I mean, absolutely giant. These male grizzlies can weigh twice the size of females, and while we don't see them very often, it's always a surprise when they show up. The other top predator that we see on tour during the spring are wolves, and we usually see them in April, which is why this video is so snowy, versus grizzlies we see usually in May. In this video, we have the Lower Grovant pack really putting some pressure on this herd of elk. And you can see that I've sped up this video just a little bit, and I did that so that we can see how elk move in response to these wolves. They're almost like a school of fish or a flock of birds when these wolves chase them, or even when the wolves just move around them. On this particular day, a couple members of the Lower Grovant pack did end up taking down an elk from this herd. The Lower Grovant pack is the most visible wolf pack in Grand Teton National Park and then also on the elk refuge. And they are quite a large pack. This previous fall, we believed they numbered 17 members. Currently, they number 12 adults. And the reason for that is because one wolf got hit and then a number of wolves also dispersed from this pack. And that's usual. As wolves grow up, they tend to leave the pack that they were born in to try and start their own pack. Meanwhile, the members that have stayed behind are really focused on raising this year's litter of pups. And April is the time when wolf pups are born, and May is usually when the first sightings of those wolf pups occur. Now, in the Tetons, wolves tend to be much more secretive than in Yellowstone, and so we usually don't see wolf pups. But it's great to know that the next generation of wolves that will be hunting elk and patrolling our beautiful valley are being born and raised right at this time. One group of wolves, besides the Lower Grovant pack that we've been watching, is this pair of wolves that seem to have grouped up during the springtime here in Jackson Hole. And so here's the female. She's incredibly beautiful. We believe that she is actually from the Lower Grovant pack. I mentioned earlier that these wolves will leave their packs to try and start their own. And since April, Marchish, we haven't really seen these wolves at all. They've become incredibly secretive and hidden, which is typical when they have pups. But recently on tour, one of our guides was able to see this beautiful female in her summer coat, and so great to confirm that they're still out and about. Of course, a lot of wolves don't actually live in the national park. We also have wolves in the national forest. And so here's a quick video of a wolf pack up in the Bridger Teton National Forest. Not taken on tour or anything, but cool to see other wolves out there. And here is our surprise carnivore for this month. This is an American marten, a carnivore that is much smaller than the grizzlies and wolves that we see out on tour. And actually, they are a lot harder to see, largely because of their small size. And so it was quite a treat to be able to see this small carnivore. Now, martens are no less voracious or predatory than grizzlies and wolves. In their realm, in their size realm, they are a top predator in their own right and hunt squirrels, ground squirrels, birds. They eat eggs and other denizens of the forest. Well, it was great to see all of those grizzlies and wolves and American martens out on tour this month. Hopefully this next month is just as busy and active up in the national parks. Before we move on, I want to give a shout out to some of our guides who contributed to those videos. Ben Jewell, Ryan, and Chris, thank you all so much for contributing videos to this broadcast and everything. And we wouldn't be able to have the content to show our guests and our visitors to our Facebook page without you guys out there taking great videos. And I also want to give a shout out to some viewers who are regular. Hey Don, great to see you again. And yeah, it's been 2 months since we've been live, and it's great being back. We just got out of the off season and we just did guide training, and now we're in full swing. We got a bunch of new guides here at Eco Tours, and everything's looking great. So good to be back doing these broadcasts. Up next, we have a really special video. It's a short one, but it's really beautiful. It's on the northern lights that we had here in Grand Teton National Park. And while we didn't see this on tour, a bunch of guides and staff went up into Grand Teton and onto the elk refuge to view the northern lights. And some of the footage they got was absolutely magical, and I really wanted to share that with you all. And so without further ado, we'll move on to our Northern Lights video. This month in Wyoming and much of the United States, you were able to see the Northern Lights. This was super special for us, and many of our guides were able to go up into the national park and capture some videos and photos of the Northern Lights. The Northern Lights are also known as the Aurora Borealis, and they are a result of disturbance in the Earth's magnetic sphere that is caused by solar wind. Essentially, what's happening is ionization and excitation of atmospheric particles, primarily protons and electrons, that are precipitating into the upper atmosphere and is causing this dazzling show. We do occasionally see the Northern Lights in Grand Teton National Park. Last year I saw them 3 times, but a show of this proportion has not been recorded since the early 2000s, and so this was incredibly special for us. Some of those photos were, impressive, especially that last one by Roy. Talk about breathtaking with the reflection of the Northern Lights and Tetons in that beaver pond. Just absolutely incredible. If you're wanting to see some more content by guides, after this broadcast, you guys can scroll back through our broadcast and you can check out some of the Instagram pages of the guides who took those Northern Light photos, and they are incredibly talented. And so feel free to check them out later. Up next, we have Sarah Ernst talking about baby animals. It is springtime and we have lots of babies out there in the wilderness currently.
Hello wildlife watchers, this is Sarah Ernst coming to you from a patch of mule's ear wildflowers, a native wildflower of these parts. When I lead a trip, often people will ask, well, what's your favorite time of year for wildlife watching? And my answer is all year round, because every time of year there is something amazing happening out there, from the wolves of the winter, bears in early spring, the elk bugling in the fall. In June, definitely the highlight for me is the baby wildlife. We can see everything from 30-pound bison babies to the tiniest little baby weasels scurrying across the landscape. We're going to talk a little bit about the wildlife that we've been seeing across Jackson Hole and Yellowstone over the last month and show you some of our favorite scenes that we've had over the month. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategy each animal has when it comes to bringing your baby out into a dangerous wild world. The first hoofed animal or ungulate that we see giving birth in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is the American bison. Much earlier than the rest of the hoofed animals, we see our first bison calves on the ground sometimes as late as the last week of March or so, and then through April and May and into June. About 80% of the Yellowstone bison have May birthdays. We call them red dogs for their somewhat canine-looking appearance and playful behavior. At around 2.5 months old, they start shedding their orange fur, and around 4 months old, they're solid brown. With both bison and moose calves, they will begin to travel alongside their mother within a few hours of being born. In the case of bison, they will rejoin the herd. In the case of moose, they will travel by their loner mother's side for the rest of the year and sometimes into the next year as well. Moose are one of the only big animals we see around here that will have twins on occasion. In Jackson Hole, that's about 1 out of every 20 moose will have twins. I'd imagine being pregnant with a moose calf with those long legs would be unpleasant enough during your last trimester with all that kicking. But being pregnant with twins and 8 little legs kicking out in different directions must be a lot for that moose mother to go through. While bison and moose are both large and aggressive enough to defend their young against predators, the smaller ungulates will prefer to hide their young the first week or 2 after giving birth, only coming back to nurse them a few times per day. Elk calves have a high predation rate. About 2 out of every 3 elk calves that are born are preyed upon by predators within the first year, including grizzly bears like 399, wolves, mountain lions, and even golden eagles. To help protect their young against predators, it's safest for the females to hide them until they're large and fast enough to travel with the herd. The elk calves have very little scent, and that does not travel very far, as they tend to lay very low amongst the grass or sagebrush or willows. And they also have white spots that help camouflage them against the dappled background. Our smaller two members of the deer family, mule deer and white-tailed deer, will follow a similar strategy to the elk, having young with spots to help for camouflage and very little odor, and hiding them the first week or two after they're born. Many of us will sometimes encounter these fawns in our neighborhoods, as deer are pretty successful at integrating themselves with human society today. It's very important to leave fawns alone when you find them, even if it looks like they're abandoned. The female will usually not approach if you're nearby, and moving them will decrease the chance that the mother and fawn will be able to reunite. Pronghorn fawns are my very favorite to watch. Within a few days of being born, a pronghorn fawn can already outrun a human, so when they get a case of a zoomies, they can really tear it up. Pronghorn does' uteruses are bicornate, kind of meaning heart-shaped, and in a human female that can lead to reproductive problems. But in a pronghorn, it helps keep them balanced, having one baby in each corner, and because, like elk, they also have a fairly high predation rate on their young, it gives them a chance to have an heir and a spare, another one to carry on the genes in case one gets taken out by predators. Mountain goat kids are about the same size as pronghorn fawns when they come out, but unlike pronghorn fawns, they're able to leap around the cliffs that they're born on just a few hours of being born and stay by their mother's side, similar to the bison and the moose. Also, like bison and moose, the females are very aggressive in defending their young because they typically don't encounter many predators on the high cliffs that we see them on their whole lives. One of the only predators on mountain lion kids are eagles, which will occasionally knock a kid off of the cliffs where they're able to then go fly down and feed on it. All of these hoofed animals are born from mid to late spring, partly to take advantage of the abundance of forage at that time of year, the new grasses coming out, the new leaves coming out on the trees, but also to overwhelm the predators with availability. If all the young were staggered out over the course of the summer, the predators would be able to pick them off one by one. But if all the hoofed animals give birth at the same time, the predators can only eat so many when they're abundant. For our canine predators, they give birth a little earlier than the hoofed animals, usually around April into May for foxes, but typically before we see the green up that we get later on in the season. In the case of wolves, that's to take advantage of the weakened condition of our ungulates at the end of the winter and the beginning of the spring, and that transitions into the availability of young later in spring and into early summer. In the case of foxes, that's to take advantage of all of the rodent availability that time of year. Coyotes, being prey-wise in between foxes and wolves, take advantage of both resources. All three of our wild canine species will give birth in a den and raise their pups there the first few months of their life. The den can be dug out of the earth or in other protected places such as boulder fields. We've even seen them den under buildings in Grand Teton National Park. The den helps protect them from other predators as well as environmental factors like weather. And as the pups grow bigger, their eyes open, their fur comes out, and they begin to travel further and further away from their den in exploration. Wolves will eventually move their young to a rendezvous site at the end of summer, beginning of fall, when they're able to travel. Contrary to popular belief, most canines do not spend the night in dens. We see wolves lying around a den site while the pups are inside guarding it, but prefer to sleep out in the open themselves. One of the biggest threats to wolf pups are other wolves, so by laying outside the den when they sleep, they can keep an eye out for danger. Meanwhile, way back in midwinter when the wild canines are breeding, the bears, both the grizzly bears and the black bears, are already giving birth deep within their dens underneath the snow. The young are just a pound or so when they're born, without fur, and their eyes and ears are sealed shut. They will nurse on the females for 2 months in the den before they come out in the springtime. Black bear cubs will travel with their mother for the next year, nursing and also being taught how to find food across the ecosystem. This fall, they'll go into the den with her and hibernate, nursing, but also taking advantage of her body heat. They're a little too small to survive the winter on their own most times. As yearlings, the female will wean them and chase them away so that she can mate again. Black bear cubs are pretty small when they leave their mother, and when we encounter them this time of year, I'll often hear people say that their mother must be around. But it's not uncommon for us to find these small black bears just making a go of it by themselves. Still, though, we want to be respectful of the 100-yard distance from young black bear cubs, even though mother might not be around. Grizzly cubs will stay with their mother much longer, usually 2.5 years, sometimes 3.5 years. The average grizzly only gives birth every 3 years, so they have a much slower reproductive system than most of the other mammals across the ecosystem. Despite all those years of mother teaching them how to find food, it's often these young grizzly bears that get into trouble with people living in neighborhoods or agricultural areas around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So if you live around this area and there's a potential of a grizzly coming into your neighborhood, it's very important to keep tempting items like bird seed, dog food, or trash well out of reach of a young, curious grizzly bear.
You know, Sarah Ernst is one of the most knowledgeable guides we have on staff. Every time I hang out with her, I feel like I learned something new. And so it's incredibly great that she continues to give us great content for Wildlife Wednesday and is available to teach you guys, a little bit about wildlife. And so thank you, Sarah, for, chipping in and talking about baby animals for us. I just want to remind everyone that in the comment section, you can ask us questions. We're going to go through a trivia section here in a little bit. And afterwards, there's an opportunity to ask us any questions you have about wildlife, about Jackson Hole, about the region. And I'll be here to answer them. And so I've got an iPad down here. I can see all your comments. And so feel free to ask any questions. And we take questions from all ages. So if you have kids or young ones watching this broadcast with you, have them ask a question. We always love to teach the next generation about our great wildlife in this country. But before we get to our comment, question, and answer section of the broadcast, we're going to go through my second favorite part of the broadcast, which is trivia. And to get to trivia, we of course have to show you guys our sponsored item for the month. And so here it is. These are Giver gloves, and they're made from Pakistan leather and are quality tested and branded here in Jackson, Wyoming. Custom made for the great outdoors. Each guide at EcoTours actually owns a pair. They were gifted to us by our boss. And when you get them from the company website, they actually come with an EcoTours brand on them, which is pretty cool. And so if you want to support us, feel free to go and check out that item as well as other things on our web store. The cool thing about the web store is all the proceeds there actually go back to the guides, which is pretty awesome. And so that helps supports benefits like health insurance and 401k for our guides who, take the videos, do the interp, and teach all of you about the amazing wildlife we have here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And if you don't want to buy anything, if you just want to donate, we do also have a donation page. And so feel free to check that out as well. But enough with that. Let's get over to our trivia from 2 months ago. I can't believe it's been 2 months. Hopefully you guys aren't too impatient. I'm sure some of you are dying to know the answer. And so we'll do a quick refresher. Our question from March, 2 months ago, was what is the largest owl species in Grand Teton? We have a couple different dimensions here. We have great gray owl for length, great horned owl for weight, barred owl for length, and yes, all three of those are found currently in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Barred owls are pretty rare, but we do see the other two on tour occasionally. All right, well, the answer for that is both A and B. And so when we are out here measuring animals, the dimensions of animals, that is a complex thing. And so we always have to think about, how are we measuring these animals? What units are we using? Are we using length? Are we using weight? Because different animals will be bigger depending on how we're measuring them, which is pretty cool. And so if you ever have a mammals or a bird guidebook, you can always look up the dimensions of those animals in there. And so, different ways to discuss on which animals are bigger or smaller. But thank you all for participating in that trivia. We had some great answers. And if you're new to trivia, I just want to tell you how it works. So every month we ask a trivia question, and then you guys get a chance to answer that question in the comment section. Later on, after the broadcast, we'll go through all of the answers, and then we'll randomly select someone who chose the right answer, and they get an opportunity to pick an item off the web store. So pretty awesome. And so that's kind of how trivia works. And so keep that in mind as we ask this month's trivia question. Here it comes. This month we're asking, why do grizzly bears have such long claws? Grizzly bears, like Grizzly Bear 399, pictured here, has incredibly long claws. And, if you were paying attention in some of our previous videos, you might be able to find the answer. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. And there she is demonstrating those claws as she walks towards us. Pretty awesome. So yeah, leave your answer in the comment section and we will come back to it later and select a winner. Pretty awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much for tuning in and checking out our trivia and watching our videos. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go through the comment section, and you can see here I have actually an iPad that I can scroll through Facebook and see everyone's comments and questions. And we're just going to go through the top and see what everyone's asking this month. All right, all the way to the top. People from all over the place. Hi, Audrey. Oh yeah, here we go. A nice shout out to Tenley. Of course, Tenley is here in the comment section actually, and so everyone give a shout out to Tenley. If you don't know who Tenley is, she used to do these broadcasts with me, and maybe someday we'll convince her to make a guest appearance once more so she can say hi to all of you wonderful people. But yeah, say hi to Tenley in the comments. All right, so looks like we have a question from Mark. And so I'll read the question real quick. I read that there was another incident of a tourist getting gored by a bison. This time it was an 83-year-old and was wondering what happened and what her current condition is. Yeah, so I did hear about this attack, this goring that happened in Yellowstone. 83-year-old woman from South Carolina visiting Yellowstone National Park. She was in Yellowstone when she decided to approach a bison. Unclear really if it was a female bison or if it was maybe a female with a baby or if it was a bull bison. But regardless of that, bison are always dangerous to approach regardless of their age or their gender. And so from what I've read, and there's not a whole lot of information at this time, from what I've read is she approached the bison, got within that bison bubble, that no-go zone where you do not want to be at all, and the bison decided to defend its space. Now, I don't know about you, but an 83-year-old person getting hit by potentially 2,000 pounds of force, that's how much a bison weighs, plus with sharp horns, does not sound great. From what I read, she was airlifted to Idaho and had some pretty serious injuries. And so, yeah, it's crazy. We get millions of visitors to these parks, and every year we kind of bear witness to these wildlife-human interactions and incidences. And it happens every year, And when I was reading the news article, it pointed out that this was not our first bison incident in Yellowstone this year. Back in April, we actually had someone who was drunk, who was intoxicated, actually chasing and kicking bison around. And of course, the bison in that scenario are going to defend themselves. And so every year, and mainly in the summer, we see this happen. And in some cases, Some people might not know better, which is kind of hard to believe because the park works really hard to notify people about the danger wild animals pose. Whenever you go through an entrance station, they ask if you want a brochure, and in that brochure it outlines the dangers of these animals. There's signs all over the roadways. Every bathroom says do not approach bison, they're dangerous. And so it's hard to believe that people would miss it, but I guess I try to be nice and give people the benefit of the doubt, I guess. Maybe I shouldn't do that. But some people, I'm sure, coming from the city don't know always how dangerous wild animals are, which is crazy. Yeah, so first official goring of the season, not a first official, I guess, bison incident, but pretty crazy. I hope she makes a recovery. As far as I know, this happened on Saturday, so not too long ago, just like a half a week ago. What is today? Wednesday. It's Wildlife Wednesday. About, a couple days ago is when this incident happened. Yeah, do not approach wildlife. Even an animal like a chipmunk and a marmot or a squirrel can draw blood. One of the most common animals to attack people in the parks are actually chipmunks. And so my general rule, especially on tour with guests, is that we do not interact with animals. We are observers, staying away from animals, obviously following that park policy of 25 yards from herbivores, 100 yards from large carnivores. But even more so, if we show up in an area and we see an animal that is distressed by our presence, take a quick photo, and then we gotta be moving on, because we want to be observers. We want to be ethical wildlife watchers. And that is something that not a lot of people are aware of when they come and visit national parks, especially if it's their first time seeing a wild animal or their first time in a national park. And so, great question. Yeah, I think I rambled on enough about that. But we have another question also about bison from Don. And it's great to be hearing from you again, Don. I'm curious, you'll have to let me know in the comment section if you're coming to Yellowstone again this summer. I know you came last year, but you'll have to let me know if you're planning on visiting. In fact, if anyone's planning on visiting Yellowstone or Grand Teton, let me know in the comment section. I would love to hear about your exciting vacation plans. Awesome. So here's our next question from Don. And so the question is, saw photos recently of a whitish bison calf in Yellowstone National Park. Very rare indeed, and that is very true. Have you ever found a bison, and I hope I pronounce this right, Bizor, I believe is how you pronounce it. And he said, just recently heard about these. Yeah, it's not something a lot of people hear about, and I hope I am pronouncing it correct. I believe the only place other than like scientific literature I've seen this word is in the Harry Potter series. In the Harry Potter books, they make like certain potions and stuff out of like goat bizarres or whatever, however you call them, or however you pronounce that word. Yeah, Harry Potter, and in that series, they make potions out of it. But it is actually a real life thing, and it's not super common. It occurs essentially in all mammals. It's where an animal or a mammal eats a lot of fibrous material, and it gets lodged in typically their lower intestine. And if you're a human and you get this, you do need to go to emergency care, because obviously that's blocking your digestive pathway, and it's going to trap toxins and stuff in your body. And so if you get that and you're unable to pass that clump of fiber, you do have to go to the hospital. Of course, wild animals do not have that luxury. And so when they get this sort of clumping in their intestines, in their gut, then and they can't pass it, then that's oftentimes a death sentence. An animal might not directly die from the toxin buildup that would happen from that. It might actually die from predators that, sense its weakened state and go after it. And I don't know of any, I've never witnessed this personally. I don't know of any guides who have witnessed this personally. But it's an interesting thing for sure. And it does happen out in nature. Oftentimes when we see carcasses, we're not always 100% sure what happened to that animal, and did the wolves kill it? Potentially. Did it die from disease? Potentially. Maybe it had an accident like a bizarre in its gut. And so Really, really fascinating. You know, sometimes if you don't do a necropsy on an animal, it's oftentimes really hard to know actually like what happened to that animal to cause its death. One thing that's interesting about wolves is they do not like the stomach contents of herbivores that they end up predating upon. And so oftentimes when you're out in Yellowstone and you come across a carcass, you can tell if that animal was actually predated upon because the wolves will shake out the gut material from that animal. Also, guys, you might have just heard a bark. That's from Dino, one of our office dogs. And if you're wanting to see some of the dogs that our guides, you know, have as pets, you can go to our Instagram page, Jackson Hole Eco Tour Adventures on Instagram, and you can check out some of the dogs that we've actually posted about. So if you hear a little bark, or if you heard a little bark, that's one of our office dogs that's hanging out while a guide is out doing his work. So don't mind him. Awesome. Hopefully that answers your question, Don, and hopefully I'm not too off on it. I mean, it's not something I discuss very regularly on tour, and so hopefully all of my information is accurate on that. Feel free to fact check me, but pretty cool, yeah. And so my curiosity now is, if wolves do not like the stomach contents of the animals that they're hunting, like elk and bison, and they go and after they kill an animal, they shake out the stomach contents, all the green material, would biologists then be able to go and find one of these fibrous clumps that was in the lower intestines and maybe determine that that was the animal's downfall? I might have to go and read up on that. Sounds interesting to me. All right, let's see what else people are asking. Yeah, great questions so far. Rebecca is saying, jealous of the Aurora pics. Must have been amazing. Rebecca, like a bunch of us on staff were out in the national park until like 3 or 4 in the morning. And like I was out till 3 in the morning. I had a tour the next day, which was crazy. Was able to get a little bit of sleep in between, but it was totally worth staying out super late and seeing the northern lights. And funny is, I was driving around the park, you know, checking out the northern lights, trying to find like cool locations to take photos of the actual lights. And I ran into Tenley in the park, which was super hilarious, you know, and we hung out for a little bit and she took some photos of us. And yeah, I'm sure all of you guys saw that great photo of her in front of the Tetons with the northern lights. Cool thing about Tenley is she actually used to work, I think it was Churchill, and she used to do like polar bear tours. And so she would see the northern lights up there. And so she knows all about like taking photos of the northern lights, which is pretty cool. And then some of the photos our guides got, like Raph and Ryan and Roy, they got some incredible photos. Like definitely go check out their Instagrams and see the photography that they take. They're pretty talented people. All right. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, yeah, so here is the website for the Giver gloves. So if you guys are interested in checking out those gloves, you can go through the comment section and there is a web address there if you are interested in checking out those cool items, you know. I do own a pair. Actually, our boss Taylor gave all of the guides gloves to wear as an end of season gift, which was super exciting for us. And so sometimes I wear mine on my snowshoe tours and cross country ski tours. And so feel free to check those out if you guys are interested in. Awesome. I'm seeing tons of answers that are looking really great. I had to pause for a second because, like I said, Tenley's in the comment section, and so she's just asking if she gets to answer the trivia question. That's so funny. Don says hi, Tenley. Let's see. Yeah, Rebecca says don't pet the fluffy cows. Actually, in town, there are a couple of stores that sell towels and t-shirts that say don't pet the fluffy cows. I think at one point we even had some towels hanging in our bathroom at the office that said don't pet the fluffy cows. And I always thought that they were funny. Of course, bison are not actually cows. They are their own thing. They are bison, but they are closely related to cows, and so they look similar. And bison can, of course, interbreed with cattle. And in some cases, like in Custer State Park, Theodore Roosevelt National Park, a lot of those bison actually do have cattle genetics, which is really interesting. Makes conservation of these animals really complex when they are not 100% purebred. Aw. Hi, Ginger. Good to see you again. Oh, nice, Dawn. You're saying next year, so June 2025. Yeah, if you come back to Yellowstone, or if any of you come back to Yellowstone, feel free to reach out to us and say hi. Yeah, that would be awesome. Ooh, this is a really good question. I hope I can answer it. All right, so Mark is asking, how has attendance been so far in Grand Teton and Yellowstone parks so far this season? And what projects are underway to improve the visitor experience? Oh my gosh, this is a really good question. Hopefully I can answer it in a educated way. So currently we don't have any statistics on visitor usage quite yet, and that's just because the season has just started, and the park usually takes a little while to release those statistics. But from what I'm experiencing is we're kind of like right on average is what I would say. I've been guiding here. This is my 5th summer guiding in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks for the same company, Jacksonville Ecotour Adventures. And in that time, I've definitely witnessed fluctuations in the amount of visitors that we get coming to the national parks. And it's really fascinating, actually, because, like, for example, last year, I believe July was comparatively slow, but then August and June were like really busy. And so it kind of evened it out, and we kind of, I believe, hit average, or we were below average slightly for that year. And so these fluctuations do kind of affect sometimes the visitor experience. Obviously, if you're in the national park, it's really great to get away from crowds, and there are areas in the park that are more crowded than others. And for us on tour, of course, we're worrying about traffic. And, if we roll up to an animal, how many other people are going to stop or already be there looking at those animals? And so it is something to think about when you're visiting this region. My recommendation is always to visit this area during a less busy time. And so definitely check out like our off seasons. October, November are great times to come visit, early December, and definitely check out April. April is a great time to visit because we got the elk migration going on, and they're streaming off of the refuge right into the national park, which is really exciting. And then of course we got bears popping out of hibernation, which is super great. But as far as this year, I want to say, and this is honestly kind of a guess, that we're right at average. And that's just from my personal experience guiding in the park over the past couple of weeks. As far as improvements for, the visitors' experience in the national park, the park is constantly working on, mitigating against crowds in certain areas, and also working on road construction. Surprisingly, road construction can definitely be a big deal, for people in the national park. We think it's a national park, it's pristine, but for people to come and see it, there needs to be, constant road maintenance, especially in colder regions like Yellowstone when we get frost heaves and stuff. And so currently they're working on some projects like the Moose Wilson Corridor, which will hopefully cut down on some of the roadway traffic that people experience. Another important thing that the park is always working on for the visitor experience is mitigating human-wildlife interactions. And so earlier we had a question, obviously, about the bison goring in Yellowstone. The part, obviously, that's distressing to experience, and even if someone isn't gored, it can be incredibly distressing to see people act unethically around animals, behaving badly, approaching moose, approaching bears. We just don't want to see that. It takes away from the experience that people come here looking for. And so currently in Grand Teton, there is a group of volunteers called the Bear Brigade, and they work really hard at mitigating a human-wildlife conflict on roadways specifically. And so if you're a guest coming to Grand Teton, you might see a bear on the side of the road. If that is true, there's odds are there's going to be a large crowd there, and there will be volunteers from the bear brigade making sure people aren't approaching that wildlife or that animal. If the bear or other animal is wanting to cross the road, the bear brigade will try and make a passage for them so that they can cross without getting hit by a car and without being too close to people. Another thing the park is working really hard on is wildlife vehicle collisions. And that's not just the national park that's working on that. That is a huge part of our community because most people here make their money off of wildlife, even if it's not directly. You know, people come here to view bears and they buy dinner at the local restaurant, they buy hotel rooms. And so it's really great living in a community that is so wildlife conscious. And so we've got a lot of projects working on mitigating against wildlife conflict. One of the biggest things that EcoTours is doing is 2% of all of our funding or all of our revenue from our tours goes to a nonprofit that is called the Wildlife Fund that focuses largely on mitigating, you know, some of this conflict between the roadways and the wildlife that have to cross those roadways, especially in migration corridors. And actually our boss, Taylor Phillips, actually started that organization. And so if you are interested, be sure to check that out. And yeah, pretty cool. So one thing that's cool is we do, as a community living next to wildlife, have problems with wildlife. The park obviously recognizes that, they do what they can, but the community seems to work really hard on mitigating that conflict. And that in itself, I think, improves the visitor experience quite a bit. Great question. Hopefully that was a good answer. Sweet. We got lots of other questions. Oh my gosh. All right, Dawn asked another question. How does it happen that a deer or elk shed antlers and they grow the same shape, even larger the following year? That's a really good question. From what we understand about deer and their antler growth is that it's largely driven by genetics. And so, excuse me, I got a little stuffy there. It's largely driven by genetics. And so different regions of the country and of the world where deer populations exist, elk are a species of deer, they have different shaped antlers. And even locally, we see that. In Jackson Hole, we do actually have two different elk herds. We have the Jackson elk herd, and then we have the Fall Creek elk herd, which is south of town. And what's interesting is even though these two elk populations are pretty close to each other and they are exchanging genetic material for sure, there seems to definitely be a difference in the size and the shape of the antlers. Elk in the Jackson elk herd tend to have larger antlers than elk in the Fall Creek herd, which is really interesting to observe. And so on a population level and then on an individual level, genetics seem to be one of the biggest factors that determine whether an antler has an extra tine or how big the antlers are, or even if an elk antler is palmate. And that seems to be pretty true across the deer family. So even like moose and caribou and deer from the old world, like axis deer, sambar deer, they all have this pattern of antler growth that's largely driven by genetics. And it's also driven largely by female selection. So over time, antlers in a population might change. They might get bigger, for example, and that's driven by sexual selection. You know, those females choosing the antlers on the males that look the best, that have the widest tips, maybe the sharpest points, or are the largest. And interestingly, biologists have found that female deer prefer elk and other males that have symmetrical antlers. And so that's why antlers are almost always the same on both sides. It's because the females really want antlers that match. You know, it's aesthetically pleasing. So largely driven by genetics. Other things that can influence antlers from year to year include diet and include health. So a diseased elk or an elk that maybe experienced a dry summer is not going to grow antlers as large as maybe previous years. And so that's related to the environment. And so the shape might be the same, but the size might be smaller, just depending on environmental resources and how healthy that individual was. And then as far as growth over time, over like the life of an elk, typically we find that their antlers are smallest when they're young. And then as they grow, their antlers increase in size, increase in mass, they become a lot heavier, and increase in girth, And then around the middle of their life, for a bull elk, I would say about 7 to 11-ish years in life, their antlers kind of peak, and that's when they're at their largest. And for a lot of elk, that's also when they're most reproductively viable. That's when they have the largest harems of females. That's when they're most able to compete with other bull elk for mating rights to those females. And really interesting to come in the fall and watch the elk rut. The social interactions they have with each other is really fascinating. After that 11-year mark, the elk begin to decline in health and fitness, and their antlers shrink in size, but they don't shrink in girth. And so how that works is antlers grow from what's called a pedicule, which is you can almost imagine it like a tooth socket. The antler grows from the tooth socket, or from the antler socket in this case, and that socket never changes size, or it only grows as the elk gets older. And so you can sometimes, if you find antlers or if you find a dead elk, you can give like a rough estimate of its age by how wide the pedicules are, that socket is, where that antler was being held. Awesome, great question. Let's see what other ones we have. Oh yeah, so Mark, the May statistics are not out yet, but Tenley did put up a link for the data from last year. And so if you're wanting to read some statistics from last year, check out that link in the comment section. I just pinned it on the video, and you can go and check out what the statistics look like from last year, and then you can come back to that website at the end of the year after some time has passed to see what the report is for this year currently. Awesome. Mary is asking, any special methods used to maintain numbers of bison in the Jackson Hole area? And yes, there are methods being used to maintain the Jackson Hole bison herd. And so to give everyone some quick history, the bison herd in Jackson Hole has not remained stable over its long history. We started out with very, very few animals, just a couple individuals. At one point we had around 20, and they were actually being kept in an enclosure within the national park, which is really interesting. But they tested positive for brucellosis, which is a disease that can transmit to cattle. It's very politically contentious. And most of those bison, because of that, were culled. And so our bison herd started out with just a few individuals. And then from that population, it grew exponentially. In the 1980s, the bison began to discover the National Elk Refuge. And that is where conflict began to arise. At that time, the bison numbers were continuing to grow. At that time, they were a couple of hundred. By the end of the 1990s, there were getting close to be 1,000 bison in the Jackson Hole region. And at one point, we went over 1,000 bison. And there was a lot of concern that bison were going to compete with elk on the National Elk Refuge for the alfalfa supplemental feed that is given to the elk in the winter. And in some cases, that proved to be true. Bison are much larger than elk, and they would push them off. Another important point to bring up is the elk are not just being fed, and that's their only food. They have to forage for their food. The alfalfa is just a supplement, and bison do compete with elk pretty heavily for food out on the refuge. And so there was a lot of concern about bison overpopulation. In a lot of places, this is a problem because bison reproduce very successfully. They don't have very many predators. And so in areas like Wind Cave National Park, Theodore Roosevelt National Park, Yellowstone, all of these bison populations are growing, and park managers have had to figure out solutions to manage them. What Grand Teton has decided to do, and what really Wyoming has decided to do, is to host an annual bison hunt. And so this hunt does not occur in the national park. It occurs in the Bridger Teton National Forest and on the elk refuge. And so it only occurs when bison leave the safety of the national park, and it only occurs during a very specific time of year. Most bison are harvested in late winter. And so, of course, this is incredibly controversial and contentious. You know, there's many people who don't even believe that we should be hunting bison because their genetics are not great. Earlier, I said that a lot of bison populations have cattle genetics and that we should be working on preserving our current genetic pool and not hunting them. And that's an incredibly valid point. And so it is an incredibly controversial subject. And I mean, for many people, hunting bison was tradition at one point. And so for both Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks, when those bison herds leave the park, those parks do allow on the border of the park a natives hunt is what it's called. And currently on the elk refuge, people from the Wind River Reservation, from the Shoshone tribe, are allowed to go and harvest bison on the elk refuge. And so, short answer, the population is being controlled currently by hunting. Pretty straightforward. It becomes more complex when we begin to look at the conservation behind bison and the conversations that people have about bison conservation out here. And it gets complex when you look at it on a landscape level. When we start looking at different parks and different reserves, each one kind of has its own method. There's not a clear answer all the times when it comes to these problems, like how to control bison numbers. In the past, people have used contraceptives, they've done cullings, and Grand Teton's solution has been to host a hunt on the border of the national park. Yeah, great question. Hopefully that was a good answer. All right. Oh, nice. So Melissa is asking, is saying and asking, we'll be there in August, which is super exciting. That will be a really fun time, kind of during the bison rut. And so I'm hoping you guys will be able to get to see some bison action, maybe some fights or definitely some roaring from the bison as they're courting those females. Pretty exciting. And you're asking, do your tours include Yellowstone entrance tickets, or do we need to buy those on site? Great question. So currently how it works is the total price of the tour does not cover the entrance to the national parks. So when you come on tour with us, you do have to buy a park entrance pass. The great thing is they do have entrance passes that, if you're senior, last for a lifetime, or if you're below senior, younger than a senior, you can have them for an entire calendar year. And that's what I do. I, of course, go to the national parks on my own a lot, and then I can't use my guide privileges to get in, and so I have to present my own pass. And so I get the interagency annual pass is what it's called. Pretty great deal. It's $80 to all national parks in the United States for a whole calendar year. And so that's always my recommendation. Even if you don't have plans to go to another national park, plans change. It's always great to have. And that money goes to supporting the national parks. And so to answer your question, the cost of the tour does not include admission. If there are special circumstances, like maybe someone loses a credit card before the tour or something like that, that can of course be communicated, and we can figure that out during the tour or after the tour. And so it's not always a huge deal for us to figure out with you. And so yeah, those park passes are pretty sweet when you get them. I've been to six national parks this year, and I've used my pass at every single one. And so I haven't had to pay entry to any of them except for that one-time fee at the beginning of the year. Pretty great. Awesome. Here is some more information linked by Tenley on park passes for the National Park Service. And so if you're interested in getting some more information about park passes and how that all works, feel free to check that link out. Looks like I can't fit the whole link on the page, but if you go back into the comment section, you can find that link and get some more information. on park passes and everything. All right, we're almost out of time, but we have one more question. I'm going to answer it because I don't want to leave this one question standing. Rebecca is asking, I think I remember in recent years, I saw an issue with diseases and decline in elk and bighorn sheep populations. Maybe? Did I make it up? Has it improved? All great questions. Yeah, what is the current status of disease in the elk population and the bighorn sheep population? Really great questions. So disease is definitely incredibly influential on wildlife populations. This is something that is kind of still being learned. Historically, disease was always kind of like cast aside as far as research because it wasn't as glorious as watching, interactions between wolves and elk. But disease, interactions between viruses, prions, bacteria, and elk are just as important when understanding an ecosystem. And so, as far as our status is going, elk have the potential to get chronic wasting disease in this ecosystem. It is a disease that is spreading into our region, and some animals have tested positive for the disease. It is a big concern. It seems to be spreading pretty slowly in the region, however. A lot of people were concerned that it was going to come in quick and wipe out the population, but it seems to be progressing a lot slower than some people expected. An example is in 2020, an elk tested positive on the National Elk Refuge for chronic wasting disease. First time that has ever happened. And I don't believe since then another individual has tested positive. And so it does spread slowly. The problem with that disease, it is 100% fatal. And these diseases spread exponentially. And so if we imagine a disease coming into a new region, how prevalent that disease is when it first starts out is very low. But then over time, it could skyrocket as that population gets more and more infected and that disease transmission increases. And so currently, like on the National Elk Refuge, things seem to be about stable as far as the chronic wasting disease. The National Elk Refuge just did a big 5-year experiment to see if they could reduce the amount of time elk were reliant on feed on the National Elk Refuge. And because of some severe winters and everything, that experiment was, I wouldn't say unsuccessful. It wasn't successful in reducing the amount of feed. It was successful in that it was an experiment, and we now have more knowledge about how harsh winters influence elk populations, and we have more information about, in the years we were able to reduce feed, what did the elk do? We do now have information about that. And so the experiment wasn't a failure, but there was a failure in reducing the amount of reliance elk have on feed on the National Elk Refuge. Hopefully that makes sense. For the bighorn sheep, their status in the past 4-ish years since I started guiding out here has been relatively the same. There is still an incredible amount of concern for the bighorn sheep in Grand Teton National Park that are actually living up in the Tetons. The concern is that mountain goats, which are non-native to the region, they were introduced into Idaho for hunting and then spread into the national park. There's concern that they are carrying pneumonia and other diseases that could threaten the bighorn sheep, who already have an incredibly low population and are vulnerable to things like disease and disturbance. And so what the National Park Service has decided to do is to eliminate, to the best of their ability, the mountain goat population in Grand Teton National Park. And for the most part, they've been very successful at it. And in the coming years, we will have to see if that has a positive influence on the bighorn sheep. This management, though, is definitely last resort. This bighorn sheep population is incredibly endangered, and anything could wipe them out pretty easily. When a population is very low, the bighorn sheep population in the Tetons is only about 100 animals. They become incredibly vulnerable to things even like avalanches. And so an avalanche could come through and even wipe out a good portion of the herd and jeopardize the population. And so that is a big concern. For our other sheep population in the Gros Ventre Mountains, those sheep are kind of at a population peak of about 500 animals, when we see them get to that 500 animal mark, they tend to have a population crash. And so there's a lot of concern about our Gros Ventre sheep herd, population descending into maybe 50, 100 animals, like they have in the past. And so to mitigate against that, the Wyoming Game and Fish has initiated what's called a ewe hunt. A ewe is a female sheep, and they're doing that to try and reduce the population growth of this sheep herd, to try and reduce the effects that disease have on the population. Hopefully that makes sense. Every winter we see sheep die on the National Elk Refuge. Sometimes from predators, but oftentimes their cause of death is unknown, and it's likely that some of those sheep are dying from pneumonia, unfortunately. And so that's kind of this disease status for elk and bighorn sheep in the valley currently. It'll be interesting to see in the coming years what happens to these populations. All right, well, thank you all so much for your great questions and for tuning in and watching the videos we worked so hard to make. And I really hope that we're able to see you guys next month. Of course, just a quick reminder, it's the first Wednesday of every month. Please come join us. Bring your kids, have them ask some questions. I'm really big on educating, the next generation of conservationists. And so thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month. All right, bye.